Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Erin Monroe. I'm the Robert H. Schutz Jr. Associate Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. It is my great pleasure to have you join me today. We are going to take a tour of Paul Manship, Ancient Made Modern, our new special exhibition. And this exhibition just opened, as you can see, February 11th, and we are so excited to have a long run of a show, open till July 3rd. And I hope that gives those of you that are able to come and in the area a chance to come see the exhibition. And those of you that are perhaps not local, we will be planning a virtual tour of the show that we will post later. I believe the filming of that is in about 2 weeks. So my talk today will include some installation views of the exhibition, as well as a deep dive into really some of the fantastic works of art that we've put on display to help explore this topic of ancient made modern. On the screen, you see a young Paul Manship in the studio wearing his quintessential bow tie, which was sort of a trademark of his style. And in the center of the screen is a beautiful 1916 sculpture called Flight of Night. And on the right-hand side is a work not by Paul Manship, but an ancient Greek vessel used to hold oil. That's one of the other works of art in the show that will be seen in conversation with Paul Manship's work as we begin to look at essentially Manship becoming Manship. This is an exhibition that takes a close look at the first half of his career, how he became a celebrated American sculptor. By no means a retrospective. We bring you through the early 1900s and end at 1934 with his incredible gold Titan Prometheus at Rockefeller Center. So I just wanted to offer this install view to show you really the look and feel of the exhibit. Many of us appreciate this kind of sophisticated palette. There's this beautiful blue wall that we chose to. That wall color is meant to sort of honestly give those bronzes a chance to shine and a chance to be more legible than they are. If it was, in some instances, works that are typically installed in our American galleries against white walls, it can be a little unsympathetic. So it's a really sympathetic exhibition design that weaves you through, as I said, Manship's early years as a student and his formative experiences in Italy and travels abroad, and then brings you back to sort of the heyday of New York City where he lived and worked. So I love this quote, and it's sort of in my mind, something worth keeping in mind as we look at the way Manship honed his skill in bronze. And it truly was from looking at art of the past and studying and learning the lessons. Again, you see a young Paul Manship in the studio. And I'll briefly touch upon how Manship got to Italy, which I've mentioned, and say that really the time period we're looking at in the early 20th century, many of us think of Paris as the artistic capital for modern art. And truly, cities such as Paris and Berlin certainly had instances where modern art was sort of emerging from those cities. Not to say Italy did not, but there is a distinction in the path that some artists took studying in Paris and then coming back to the United States, and someone such as Manship who finds those early years in Italy. You can imagine, steeped in ancient art and architecture. And how he got to Italy is in some part thanks to an individual you see pictured in this archival photograph. So Manship's there in the overalls right in the center, and he has his arm around his mentor at the time, a Hungarian sculptor named Isidore Conti. And Conti was, as you can see, significantly older, well established, his studio in New York was sort of a place where you could apprentice and learn, learn by watching and learn by doing, which was so critical in terms of learning sculpture and how to sculpt. Conti himself had studied in Italy, and he recognized this early talent in Paul Manship and encouraged him to apply to the American Academy in Rome. Before I continue, I'll say on your screen as well as an early sketch that Manship made during some of his formal training here in the United States. So his bio, I'll just touch upon. He was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, demonstrated some early interest in art making and took classes in high school. And then his parents enrolled him at the only school in town, the only formal art school, the St. Paul Academy of Fine Art. So we're thinking, it's about 1905, 1906. Manship quickly realizes that there is greater opportunity to pursue his career as an artist by attending the well-established art academies in places like Philadelphia and New York City. So the drawing on the left is from one of his classes at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, an opportunity for him to study from live models and really hone his ability to depict the human body faithfully, studying anatomy and the contours of the body, which sort of was foundational to his conceiving of how to render something in 3 dimensions. So we have this Pennsylvania moment on the left, studying with Conti in New York on the right. And thanks to Conti's sage advice, Manship wins what's called the Rome Prize, offered by the American Academy in Rome. And he immediately heads to Rome in 1909. And you can see here, this is a postcard he sent home within months of arriving. And it's a shot of him in the studio, an early clay model of a sculpture you'll see in its finished form momentarily, sits upon the top shelf in the middle. And right away, he has this incredible experience. His creative imagination is fueled by immersing himself in Italian art, and that's everything from obviously ancient art to sculpture from the Renaissance. And I love this quote that he says to his family: "Rome is a great place. Each day I find new places of interest. I'm having the time of my young life." And who wouldn't? For any of us that have been fortunate enough to study abroad, I mean, those experiences are exceedingly formative. I wanted to take a quick sidebar and offer a little context for what we're about to see in terms of Manship's works, which are bronzes by artists from the preceding generation. Frederick Remington on the left and Daniel Chester French on the right. So this tradition of working in bronze certainly wasn't new to Manship's generation, but the subject matter that he's choosing, which is highly mythological and allegorical, in some ways is quite different from artists who were turning to, say, quintessential American types. On the one hand, cowboys and westerns, and on the other hand, real historical figures from time. But these 2 works demonstrate, the types of artworks that were in the ether in earlier generations. And in fact, Daniel Chester French sat on the committee of the American Academy of Rome that awarded Manship his prize. So the worlds are pretty intertwined when you get down to the sort of interconnectedness of American artists working in bronze. So here we are back in the exhibition, and I wanted to offer just a quick snapshot of how we've paired ancient artwork literally in conversation with Manship's works. So on the left is a 1912 work by Manship, and on the right, a work by 1913, and in the far background is an ancient Greek water vessel. So the actual experience of this show is wonderful because you can assess sort of that art of the past, the type of thing that Manship was looking at, and then pivot around and look at how he translates that, the styles, the subjects, and even the patterning and ornamentation of these ancient artworks into his work. I'll just say as well, we are drawing from the strength of the Wadsworth collections in terms of this ancient material. But in many instances, it's exactly the type of thing that Manship would have seen while abroad. Certainly he was based in Rome, but we know he traveled to Greece, throughout the Mediterranean, as well as making a stop in Egypt. And on the left, you have an Assyrian panel from a royal palace in what is present-day Iraq. And these panels are actually largely available for public study in major museum collections, including the Met, the British Museum, places that Manship would have spent time in. And as I said, this Greek water vessel is also from our collection. Just to sort of offer a starting point, Manship's in Rome from 1909 to 1913. This work is from 1912. So we see him sinking his teeth into the material of bronze, a material that he would favor throughout his career, although he did work he did sculpt in other media. The figure is called Lyric Muse, and she's a mythologically inspired subject, the muse of romantic poetry. And it's a little difficult to see on the screen here. It's quite a small statue, maybe about 8 inches high, but her mouth is slightly open, and in her hand she holds a lyre. So this suggests that she's speaking or singing. And some of the hallmarks of this work are really what defined Manship's sculptures as feeling modern and of the moment. She has this beautiful, highly polished bronze surface, but he's beginning to fuse some of the stylistic elements from ancient art, including almond-shaped eyes and low relief carved features. So you'll see this more, probably more easily in another sculpture, but these are traits that are coming from ancient art and ancient statuary. This incredible work of art is one of the pieces that earned Manship great acclaim when he came back to New York after studying in Rome. It's from 1913, called Centaur and Dryad. The imagery on top and carved around the elaborate base all addresses the narrative and sort of the story of Dionysus, the god of wine. This helps add a little bit of context to the way the centaur aggressively clutches this seemingly innocent female. As we know, followers of Dionysus tended to act somewhat frenzied and mad as a result of overconsumption. And these themes are carried through around the base illustrations, which you can see on the left, satyrs playing music, and these female figures called maenads, which are dancing, they're barefoot, they're sort of uninhibited, and this sort of revelry and debauchery was one of the traits that caught critics' attention. I mean, this is kind of a playful work. It's not somber, and there's a little bit of sex appeal, to be perfectly honest. Seen in modern eyes, the context obviously feels a little different with a 21st century interpretation, this sort of lecherous figure clutching a female against her will. But some of what earned Manship his acclaim is how he treats these mythological subjects in new and dynamic ways. There's a sense of drama here, as well as a new attention to surface detail. So I mentioned low relief carving. That's how we would describe the hair of both of these figures, and the technique Manship would have used to add the detail to the hem of the figure's drapery, that sort of Greek key pattern. What earned Manship acclaim was the fact that this looks partly like he had drawn in bronze, which really was quite remarkable and took a lot of skill. Critics also loved how Manship blended styles from different cultures, and this is where our Greek artifacts come in. You can see this Greek key pattern, the bands of design, and the taller vessel on the right, sort of framing our dancing figure. And similarly, in the larger vessel on the left, And I mentioned Manship went to Greece. When he was in Greece, he made numerous sketches of this type of patterning and ornament that he saw all over the place in architecture, in these everyday objects. And in fact, he was struck by the beautiful sense of design given to these everyday objects. I mean, we're looking at essentially a water bottle and a vessel to hold olive oil, and yet they are sensitively, not sensitively, but they're beautifully designed. And that sort of abundance of beauty and pattern and ornamentation is what you see coming out in Manship's works in bronze. So I will say that the traditional format of this gallery talk would have been in the gallery, but I'm finding the lemonade of doing it virtually by offering some of these close-up details, which allow you to see how those bands of ornamentation, which we've seen on earlier ancient works, is applied to the sort of frieze-like narrative on centaur and dryad. And one of the wonderful parts of my job sometimes is the ability to dig into an artist's archive, personal letters, travel logs, travel photos. And we certainly lucked out in this instance where, and some scholars that precede me had already identified Manship's obsession with ancient art and ancient sculpture, and particularly archaic or early Greek sculpture. But this letter was too perfect not to mention in this talk, where he is literally writing to Isabel, his fiancée, about his, the impression that the Parthenon had on him and what he was looking at in Athens. And it's this decoration and ornament that really catches his eye. So on the right is a very small sketch in real life. It's about maybe 5x7 sheet of paper, but he's even inscribed, it's from the treasury of the Siphnians in Delphi, and the date at which he traveled to that site is at the exact same time that he's working through the final design for centaur and dryad. These two sketches, again, of a similar scale, and I will offer that the annotations are really interesting, and they indicate that he's looking at these large statues of female maidens called chorae, which were on display at the Acropolis Museum. So on the left is not an install view from the Wadsworth show, but a view of the Acropolis Museum. And these bands of pattern and ornament would have been, in the original form, brightly colored, as you can see in some modern sort of contemporary scholars and conservators have reconstructed what the surface detail would have looked like on these statues originally. And although it's faded over time, there are still remnants of paint, which, are also appearing in some of Manship's notes and journals, where he's remarking on the color of, for example, actually he sketched this exact sculpture, the Peplos chorae, and he remarked on the color of the band of pattern on her hem and her eye color. So it was really interesting to sort of go back in time and look at some of the key influences on his work. Now we've turned the corner in the exhibition, and we have plaster casts, which is a common way that artists would have had access to iconic works of art were they not able to travel abroad. So we have a plaster cast of a different maiden adjacent to some of Manship's sketches that help recognize and give an example of this archaic style, this sort of defined strands of hair, beautiful braids, and that low relief carving that's sort of shallow and somewhat stiff. And it's interesting to note that in the next section, you'll see how Manship departs from that stiffness, but he really responds to that carving technique. This beautiful Flight of Night is truly a summation of what Manship is doing differently. When you think also of someone like Remington or Daniel Chester French, they're skilled in their own time, but some of what makes Manship sculptures feel of the moment is he's infused a sense of motion and a sense of movement. So on the right is a depiction of the goddess Diana, the goddess of night and the hunt. And she's got this beautiful, sweeping, elegant arc. Her form looks as if she's kind of levitating above her attribute, the moon, seen in an orb. And in contrast to the earlier ancient Greek vessel, which is not necessarily Diana, but you do see sort of a female figure with these loose tunics. You know, this type of ancient garment is also sort of infiltrating popular fashion at the time. And what I wanted to offer to you was to sort of expand the interpretation of Manship sculpture to include what else was going on in American popular and visual culture. Here's a nice install view. You get a sense of the scale too of these artworks. But this is an era of a sort of newly liberated female body. You know, Manship's career coincided with huge moments of discovery and innovation and change. And on a social level, the sort of fashion of the day, we often think of the 1920s flapper dress. Well, what makes that different from earlier generations is, you know, you're no longer wearing a corset. You have this shorter, this raised hemline. And in terms of entertainment, modern dance is changing. As you can see, Isadora Duncan, one of the most celebrated early modern dancers of the 20th century, often had a sort of, or had an obsession with ancient Greece, similar to Manship, and in fact performed at the Acropolis several times, excuse me. And then you have the sort of modern nightlife. You've got vaudeville, motion picture, film. So I can't deny the fact that Manship is using a mythological subject, but he's infusing it with a contemporaneous feeling. And in terms of what else is going on in American sculpture at the time, this is another work in the Wadsworth collection by a contemporary of Manship, although they sort of occupied different artistic circles, Ellie Nodelman. And this is an example of what an artist, you know, I'll back up and say this is a what was known as a high kicker, sort of the American version of a can-can dancer, very popular in vaudeville and other live performances. But we have this beautiful, sleek, kind of smooth silhouette, which reminds me of Manship, but a completely different use of materials. We've got a carving in wood that is then painted. So some of what I think Manship excels in is he adds these surface details, not with color, but with pattern and ornamentation. And I had to put this in just to point out this fascination with speed is also quite literally connected to improvements in transportation, including the rise of the automobile, subway system, you know, airplanes, the first transatlantic phone call. You know, this pace of life is changing. And this is a hood ornament for Chrysler designed by Manship's contemporary named Harriet Frischmuth, who also sort of made her name sculpting modern dancers. So I love that sort of horizontalness is quite symbolic about, you know, kind of pushing forward into time. Speaking of pushing forward into time, one of the most spectacular set of loans in the show are these architectural designs, these large-scale relief panels that were originally from the corporate headquarters of the AT&T building, which was finished in 1921. So you see an archival photo on the right, and then more of a modern day photo on the left. So we're in Lower Manhattan, a city, rising vertically, left and right, Empire State Building, Chrysler Building. This is a moment where, interestingly enough, this sort of future forward-thinking tech company employs an architect who's using classical architecture. You can see the colonnaded facade, and is turning to leading sculptors of the day to add ornamentation both to the exterior and interior. So these relief panels were originally displayed above the main entrances to the AT&T building. And what's in place now are replicas. So this is a chance to see Manship, super confident after Centaur and Dryad was displayed among other of his bronzes from Italy in New York City. Critics just raved about his work, and the commissions kept rolling in. So this commission came in 1914, the year after he's just back from New York, fresh from his artistic training. And what's incredible to me is the AT&T building is clearly aspirational in its vision to revolutionize life through telecommunication. And what does Manship choose as his subject matter, but a sort of timeless motif of the 4 elements? So on the screen from left to right, it's earth, fire, wind, and water. And I'll let you take a look at these truly luscious panels. They're so rich in iconography. The 4 elements are tropes that had been depicted allegorically for thousands of years. And what's so wonderful is the way these bodies feel somewhat Renaissance, somewhat modern. The chance to have these sort of voluptuous curves on display, these super masculine men, chiseled abs. I mean, all of this is sort of, again, that kind of sex appeal, but using ancient forms, so it's not too risque. And then I love the addition of the gilding. I mean, it's just completely of the moment and completely energizes these incredible panels. And in researching them, come to find out that Manship was really inspired by the Tower of the Winds in Athens, an ancient tower that was quite advanced in its day. There were various instruments within the tower that helped predict the weather. And if you can imagine, what a way to revolutionize daily life if you know it's going to rain tomorrow instead of just waiting and seeing what happens. So there were different elements within the tower, sundials, a water clock, a weather vane, and it was decorated. It's an octagonal shaped structure with 8 different depictions of the wind directions. So fascinating to me to think that Manship is sort of modernizing an ancient concept in a way that still feels completely appropriate for this, as I said, this leading tech company of the day. And in terms of moving through the exhibition, I'm excited to have another rendering of Diana. We saw Flight of Night moments ago, and as we see Manship becoming more confident, more accomplished, he revisits the tale of Diana and offers this wonderful pairing of Diana and Actaeon from a different chapter in her life. And I'll just briefly mention, in case you're not as familiar, Diana was purported to be a virgin, and she was bathing in the woods when this hunter Actaeon accidentally stumbled upon her. And her punishment to him was to impale him with an arrow, which you see here. He's just clutching his side. The arrow has just impaled him. And the further punishment was to turn him into a stag. And it's hard to see here, but you can see the horns emerging from his head. And she turned his own hounds against him. So none of that gruesome detail is evident here. Instead, he's applied a sense of design where these two works are meant to be displayed with this purposeful space between them to add a sense of visual intrigue. And he's encouraging us to, or he's actually guiding our eye from left to right with the positioning of Diana's hands, this super horizontal directional angle, and then the kind of counterpoint with the way Actaeon is diagonally, reaching forward. And in some ways, it reminds me of that hood ornament. We have this horizontality, this sense of reading an image as if it is like a film. And there are stylistic qualities of this that fulfill this idea of Art Deco. Streamlined bodies, that patterning and ornamentation is there mostly in the figure's hair and the fur collar of the hounds. And we have more of that smooth, polished surface. And what's incredible about these is it's a little hard to see, but Diana's hair actually flips up behind her. So to experience these is a true walk around, and these were made in a even larger edition for Brook Green Gardens in South Carolina. And this is a moment where we wanted to offer how much of Manship's works are actually sort of ingrained in our public experience, but we might not connect his name to these objects. I just love this ancient version of Diana and Actaeon, a little more gruesome, as you can see. And Manship's, he's not quite gone there, but he is giving us this moment of high drama or high intensity. So in speaking of how Manship is, perhaps in our mental experience without necessarily knowing, he was the one that sculpted the Titan Prometheus at Rockefeller Center, that incredible backdrop to holiday photos, the sort of ice skating rink that is a cross section of bringing together people of all walks of life. And the show really brings you to this moment in the later 1920s. Obviously, for the history of America, 1929, the stock market crash was this devastating event. And coming out of that, J.D. Rockefeller had this property in Midtown Manhattan that he owned and needed to develop. And to this day, I do think his mission was fulfilled, which was to create an urban oasis and to create an environment that would bring together all walks of life, a sort of cross-section of humanity. And he employed over 100 artists and craftsmen to infuse the surrounding buildings and lobbies with artistic and sculptural elements. And Manship, I have to say, turns to mythology, turns to the ancient past. And he chooses this moment in the tale of Prometheus where he's grabbed a fireball from the gods and he's bringing it down to heaven, bringing it down to mankind, to earth, as a way to sort of impart, innovation and survival, and to think about the Great Depression as the backdrop to this project. It's quite aspirational. He's surrounded by the signs of the zodiac, this sort of metaphorical threshold between heaven and earth. And behind Prometheus is a quote, which I will read to you, inscribed in the granite, that reads, "Prometheus, teacher in every art, brought the fire that hath proved to mortals a means to mighty ends." So it's this promise of achievement and a means to survive that seems completely fitting and so appropriate for the ambition of the project. And the 18-foot Prometheus literally draws you in off Fifth Avenue. It's quite it had a function that it had to do in a way that was different than Manship's smaller statuettes. And with this idea that, you know, we have watched Manship evolve as an artist, and I think his lasting legacy has a lot to do with works of public art which were made during a time when American cities were being beautified, and a different vision for the way people come together in urban experiences. And I love this sort of my montage of, you know, Prometheus is kind of overlooking all different seasons and all different life events. And in the bottom right, you can see he too is wearing a mask. And thankfully, my sister, who's in Manhattan, verified the mask is still there. And that, you know, Prometheus is continuing to serve his role with a message of hope and prosperity. And that was the gist of my walkthrough. I would be remiss if I did not mention Prometheus, but I do hope that by now you have a better understanding, you have some name recognition with Paul Manship, and you can see how that allure of the antique past and the ancient past is something that he himself sort of adapts in a unique way that feels distinctly modern. I do have to flash my appreciation and thanks to the Manship Residency and Studios, which gave me permission to use those archival photos. And thank you, and I hope to see you soon.